Last time we spoke about the beginning of the Tikman offensive. In autumn of 1941, a thin road from Leningrad to Moscow braided with mud and grit as two colossal armies pressed towards a grim deadline. On one side, German steel sought a swift triumph. On the other, Soviet resolve rebuilt ruined lines, shoulder to shoulder with civilians who refused to surrender their city. Cities along the corridor buckled under pressure. Bryansk, Vyazma, Kalinin, yet the Red Army held firm, taught newcomers and refused to yield Moscow to the encroaching winter. The Tikman offensive blossomed as a dire race against Ratputsitsa. German panzers clawed forward through swamps and forests, sometimes breaking the front and exposing vulnerable flanks. Soviet countermeasures, though hampered by stretched reserves, stitched together new fronts and defensive corridors, buying time for the capital. Civilians endured hunger, cold, and fear of occupation as fronts shifted like winter winds. Aircraft thundered above, trains groaned amongst the damaged tracks, and soldiers treaded for warmth and survival. This episode is The Wehrmacht Struggled in October Mud. Well, hello again, and welcome back to the Eastern Front podcast week by week. I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind everybody that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of World War II? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on World War II, and so much more. So go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube. You can also produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget our sister podcasts over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that, you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, or my podcast series, Echoes of War, found on major podcast platforms. We just finished up a multi-part series covering the Japanese invasion of the Philippines. If you're looking to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. Every single cent that goes to me on my Patreon or on my YouTube channel goes straight to some new animators as I'm about to unfold basically the next stage of my YouTube channel. I'm about to release two chronological ongoing series simultaneously. One will cover the entire Second Sino-Japanese War, the other the Pacific War. It is extremely expensive, so to all of those who joined up on my YouTube membership or my Patreon, a big thanks. The German offensive towards Tikman fanned out on the 21st. The 12th Panzer Division and the 20th Motorized Division were directed at Tikman and made slow but steady progress, with Bulogash falling on the 23rd. Mud and snow created ongoing difficulties, and tanks and trucks were repeatedly losing themselves to the terrain. The level of attrition reached a point that prompted consideration from Hitler about suspending the attack. Halder persuaded Hitler to allow the operation to continue, however. Leb was granted authorization to halt the attack at his discretion, provided a bridgehead across the Volkhov River remained intact. To the southeast, the 8th Panzer Division and the 18th Motorized Division were redirected towards Bologoye, with the objective of connecting with Panzer Group 3 from Kalinin. They requested control over Panzer Group 3 and the northern wing of the 9th Army to create a unified command structure for this operation. The request was refused. The offensive proceeded despite the failure of the 3rd Panzer Group to break out of Kalinin. The 18th Motorized Division and the 126th Infantry Division managed to capture Bolshaya Vishera. In response, the 288th Rifle Division and the 267th Rifle Division delayed the German advance long enough to establish a defensive line along the Malaya Vishera River. Supporting offensives by the 2nd and 10th Army Corps towards Voishny Volochysk and Valdai were halted by strong Soviet tank-led counteroffensives. The 11th and 21st Infantry Divisions were dispatched north along both sides of the Volkhov to cover the German offensive's flanks and threaten the rear of the 54th Army. North of Kareshi, the 11th Infantry Division was halted by the 285th and 311th Rifle Divisions on the 24th. Recognizing the growing German threat, the Stavka ordered a reshaping of the Soviet force. The 310th Rifle Division and the 4th Guards Division were transferred from the 54th Army to the 4th Army. The 191st Rifle Division moved to Sitomlia and the 44th Rifle Division was assigned to defend Tikman itself. This created a layered defense around the critical railway hub at Tikman. The 259th Rifle Division was reassigned to the 52nd Army. The Soviet offensive at Sinavino continued without significant progress, with the objective of drawing German reinforcements away from the Tikman front. Now at this time, Operation Beowulf referred to two German plans to occupy the islands of Saaremaa, Ima, Muhu, and Vorosmi off the eastern coast of Estonia, at the mouth of the Gulf of Riga and the southeastern Baltic region, as part of a broader Barbarossa invasion plan of the USSR. The approximate trigger for Beowulf planning and the execution had been the Soviet Berlin bombing offensive. Soviet aircraft staged through an airfield on Osel, and although the operation had been small and largely ineffective, still prompted a German concern. Hitler had ordered a reduction of activity on these islands. Their strategic importance had been quite limited. The northern drive of Barbarossa towards Leningrad had already moved to the north, leaving the islands and their Soviet garrisons largely isolated and vulnerable to smaller craft. Now, both Beowulf I and Beowulf II shared the same objective, but were based on different starting assumptions. Beowulf I had imagined a rapid German victory in the Baltic states, particularly the seizure of Courland, its associated peninsula, as Heeresgruppe Nord advanced towards Leningrad. This would have been a reworking of Operation Albion from World War I, launched from the Courland region of Latvia. In practice, German forces had faced a lot of delays crossing into Estonian territory. Beowulf II was the operation that was actually undertaken, an attack launched from the western coast of Estonia. Diversionary attacks were employed to confuse Soviet defenders at Sudwind, Westwind, and Nordwind, with sub-plans Lull, Nau, and Stimung designed to mislead. The islands were garrisoned by about 23,700 Soviet troops of the 3rd Rifle Brigade. The German force assigned to this operation consisted of the 61st Infantry Division, reinforced with assault pioneers and some artillery. The force was transported from the Estonian coast by about 100 barges, with some ferries plus roughly 150 smaller assault boats. A joint German-Finnish naval task force covered the landings, including light cruisers Emden, Konn, and Leipzig. During diversionary naval bombardments, the Finnish coastal defense ship Immanent struck a mine off Hanko and then sunk. Vormsi was secured on September the 9th. The main assault of Mu began on the 14th. Mu was connected to Saaremaa also in Germany by a causeway. She was secured by September the 16th, and a bridgehead across the causeway was established the following day. On the 23rd, Soviet forces had been pushed back to the Sorp Peninsula, from which they were gradually forced off with assault pioneers and naval gunfire. The last Soviet troops surrendered on October the 5th. The assault on Hiiumaa began on September the 12th. Defenders retreated to the Tukuna Peninsula, with survivors surrendering on October the 21st. Due to Axis naval and air superiority, Soviet forces could not escape. Soviet losses were about 4,700 killed and about 19,000 captured. German casualties totaled about 2,850. Afterwards, the 61st Infantry Division was redirected to support the offensive towards Tikman, while the 217th Infantry Division was reassigned to strengthen the Oranienbaum pocket. As mud became a larger problem, on October the 21st, Beowulf committed orders had been drafted, and all motorized formations had to abandon their vehicles and temporarily convert to foot infantry with limited artillery. However, this proposal was outright refused by Blauich, who did not believe conditions at the front were so bad that the symbols of modern warfare needed to be abandoned. Yet senior commanders had already begun implementing similar measures. Several formations ordered their advanced battle groups to abandon vehicles and proceed on foot. Other formations had already been forced to do so due to the practical reality that all their vehicles were stuck, broken down, or out of fuel. The 41st Panzer Corps had been virtually encircled at Kalinin and was subjected to constant attacks from Konev's Kalinin front. By October the 21st, it had been in continuous combat for 18 days without any relief. The remaining elements of the 3rd Panzer Group and supporting infantry corps from the 9th Army had been tied down longer than expected, Vyazma, and then slowed to a crawl by mud as they advanced northward. After its aborted attack towards Rozhok, the 1st Panzer Division was stuck on the wrong bank of the Volga and was retreating towards Kalinin. In the span of 2 weeks, it had lost 63 tanks and had been reduced to 16 operational tanks by the 23rd of October. It also suffered over 800 casualties. Even with the arrival of elements from the 129th Division and the 6th Panzer Division, the 9th Army reported that the situation around Kalinin could not be held indefinitely, and that the Soviet forces to the south of the city needed to be forced back. The supply situation for the Luftwaffe was precarious, so much so that pilots were throwing bread out of their cockpits as they passed by to provide food. Hitler proposed that the 41st Panzer Corps seize Bajitsk, over 110 kilometers from Kalinin, shortly after they had failed to take Torzhok, about 60 kilometers away. Hitler keenly watched Goebbels' weekly newsreels, and so it is likely his view of the war was highly influenced by his own propaganda output. Furthermore, Bock demanded that another attempt to take Torzhok had been planned by the 9th Army. He did not specify whether the infantry corps of the 3rd Panzer Group would conduct the operation. Much of the original Mozhaisk defensive line had fallen to the Germans, but the Red Army had only been pushed back to a new layer of defensive lines. The Germans remained 80 to about 100 kilometers from Moscow. As German formations grew weaker, new formations flowed in to reinforce the defenders. By the end of October, 13 rifle divisions and 5 tank brigades had arrived, along with several formations raised directly in Moscow. Moreover, the 33rd Army had been inserted into the line between the 5th and 43rd Armies. The 46th Panzer Corps, positioned on the northern end of the German lines against Moscow, had lacked sufficient fuel to maneuver freely and conduct offensives. They remained on the receiving end of constant Soviet tank and air attacks. Previously, raids were carried out by groups of 2 bombers with fighter cover. By this time, the VVS had begun launching squadron-strength raids against ground targets as its strength had returned. Additionally, German airfields in the area had become so clogged with mud that planes struggled to reach takeoff speed. To the south, the 40th Panzer Corps pressed headlong down the Smolensk-Moscow highway in largely predictable assaults. Although they were winning battles due to better training, their casualties were becoming prohibitively high and unsustainable. The 2nd Panzer Division assaulted Volokholamsk alongside the 35th Infantry Division. They managed to capture the rail station just south of the town by the 25th, but Volokholamsk itself remained stubbornly in Soviet hands. The 10th Panzer Division was engaged around Istra, but had not managed to seize it. The 57th Panzer Corps had been immobilized outside Kamenskoye all week. Mud deep enough to trap tractors and tanks prevented any maneuver, and supply shortages denied them the strength to undergo any offensives. The 20th Panzer Division had been left in the rear of the Corps due to its severe depletion. The 4th Panzer Group had been consuming between 1,000 to about 1,500 tons of supplies each day, but it only received about 200 tons. This forced the Panzer Group to slowly wind down its offensives, as it was unable to sustain them. Similarly, the 4th Army had managed to grind its way towards the Narofominsk area, but they were halted by stiffened resistance and ongoing supply shortages. Quartermaster General Edward Wagner wrote on the 12th of October, "The whole front is moving. Unbelievable, this theater of war. Every day I am asked, how far will you get? I always say, so far that I have not left anyone in the lurch." The 25th Soviet counterattacks had slammed into the 4th Army and managed to push German infantry back several kilometers. The 12th Army Corps bore the brunt of the assault and was ordered to go on the defensive. The next day, the counterattack expanded against the 13th and 20th Army Corps. Kluge was forced to commit his 2 reserve divisions, but was unable to stem the Soviet attack and was compelled to request that the Army Group Reserve be released. The 19th Panzer Division repositioned itself to save the neighboring infantry divisions from a concentrated attack by Soviet tanks. Despite some defensive successes, a state of siege had been declared in Moscow on the 20th to ensure the priority flow of resources and reinforcements. There had been a temporary panic in the previous 2 weeks. Wild rumors and gossip had circulated about the collapse of the Red Army at Bryansk and Vyazma. Some rumors included that Stalin had been removed by a coup, or that German paratroopers were in the Red Square, or that German troops in Soviet uniforms were already in the city. The population felt betrayed by this apparent retreat of the elite after so much had been demanded of them, which caused a temporary hysteria. Stalin's declaration that he would remain in the city helped stabilize morale, alongside measures to ensure that shops and the metro system functioned. He also unleashed the NKVD on the city, to deal with those who did not accept this metaphorical carrot. However, this unrest had been dealt with by the 20th, so it was unlikely to be related to the declaration of a state of siege. The Luftwaffe had attempted to bomb Moscow, but on October the 25th it had managed to drop only about 1,000 tons of bombs. As a comparison, on a single day in 1944, the RAF dropped approximately 10,000 tons of bombs in the cities of Cologne, Braunschweig, and Duisburg. This occurred as part of Operation Hurricane over the 14th and 15th of October. It represented the largest weight of bombs dropped in a single 24-hour period during World War II. That same month, in 1944, the Western Allies dropped a total of about 110,000 tons of bombs. For the Moscow bombing, the damage done was utterly negligible, even if the raids proved a hostile and unpleasant experience for the city's inhabitants. The airframes of the Luftwaffe were ill-suited to such operations, even before the need to substitute payload for additional fuel. Furthermore, the vast majority of raids on Moscow involved only 3 to 10 planes. This campaign likely harmed the Germans more than the Soviets. Large quantities of supplies were required to sustain these raids, and the attrition rate remained very high. German planes had a operationability rate of about 40% due to the extensive issues caused by the severe cold, even before the onset of winter. The aircraft used for these raids were the same ones typically employed for ground support operations. The pilots who participated in the raids observed the extremely heavy and effective anti-air defenses around Moscow. Pilots who had also taken part in the Blitz noted that Moscow's air defenses were far more intense than the London defenses. British Hurricanes and American P-40 Warhawks, known as Tomahawks in the Commonwealth, and Soviet usage, were flown in for the defense of Moscow. While the Hurricane was already becoming a bit obsolete as a frontline fighter at this time, it was still capable. The Tomahawk was a preferred design amongst the Soviet pilots. Across the entire Eastern Front, the Luftwaffe was losing an average of about 268 bombers per month. Production was nowhere near replacement rates, and airframe stockpiles were rapidly depleting. A study by the Inspector General of the fighters found molds into the potentially highly negative effects of winter on the Luftwaffe was dismissed as too alarmist by Göring. Now to the south, the 26th Army and the AKVD formations defended Tula. The 50th Army had been attempting to withdraw towards Tula, but was severely depleted and lacked all heavy equipment. By the 22nd, the 4th Panzer Army had been reinforced by the 3rd Panzer Army, and both were prepared for a new offensive. On the 23rd, the 3rd Panzer Division attacked and gained some ground rather slowly. The 4th Panzer Army was initially ordered to wait until a bridgehead across the Zuja River had been secured, before it began its attack. However, the 3rd Panzers had been so delayed by conditions and Soviet resistance that by midday, the 4th Panzer Army was committed early. By the end of the day, the 3rd Panzer Army had managed to cross the Zuja and expand its bridgehead by about 6 kilometers. The 4th Panzer Army remained within 3 kilometers of Minsk, pinned by entrenched Soviet tanks on nearby high ground. Guderian blamed the lack of success on the 4th Panzer Army not being used as it had been intended to, while Schweppenberg pointed to the well-concealed Soviet positions that ambushed any German advance. The offensive was renewed on the 24th with reinforcements from the Grosse Deutschland Regiment. Nevertheless, the 24th Panzer Corps managed only a 3-kilometer advance that day after multiple attacks were repulsed. The ammunition of the 24th Panzer Corps was nearly exhausted, and the 4th Panzer Division had completely run out of fuel. Some formations in Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army required airlifts of food because their access to supplies had deteriorated to a terrible level. Taking one example was the 43rd Army Corps, which had received no supplies between the 20th and 29th. It was out of rations and nearly out of fodder for the horses. Its area of operations had already been picked clean. The fuel issue was alleviated through airlift. The mud forced the 4th Panzers to use their trucks as supply vehicles, and all of the wheeled transport was immobilized. However, the Soviet defenders fell back during the night of October the 24th. This allowed the 24th Panzer Corps to capture Chern, roughly 30 kilometers north of Mitensk. In their wake, the Soviets had destroyed every bridge possible and laid random minefields. The Germans used Panzer I tanks as sacrificial mine clearers, with the other tanks carefully following behind. A slow pursuit of the retreating Soviet forces towards Tula commenced as rear area troops desperately attempted to repair roads and bridges. Due to a shortage of trucks to move infantry, the leading battle group adopted the Soviet method, with infantry from the Grosse Deutschland Regiment riding on the backs of advancing tanks. Elsewhere, the 48th Panzer Corps, alongside the 34th and 35th Army Corps, were transferred to the 2nd Army, which was designated as responsible for the Kursk-Voronezh area. The 48th possessed only one Panzer Division. It had been reduced to 11 tanks by the 24th, and it was stalled 85 kilometers from Kursk, with Voronezh another 200 kilometers distant. The 2nd Panzer Army was then to be responsible solely for the capture of Tula. Only General Bock opposed such dispersion of his army group's strength, as it was now attacking to the north and south in addition to Moscow. Bock's war diary of the 25th of October stated, "The splitting apart of the army group together with the frightful weather has caused us to be bogged down. As a result, the Russians are gaining time to bring their shattered divisions back to strength and bolster their defense, especially since they have most of the railway lines and roads around Moscow. This is very bad." All the other generals at the OKH and the OKW either meekly submitted to Hitler's desires, in this case, or they were so entangled by the lure of victory that they had long disregarded reality. This situation would only worsen in the coming days. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army would also lose the 1st Cavalry Division, as it was ordered to be returned to Germany and converted into the 24th Panzer Division. This process would take months to complete, and would return to service in Russia in the summer of 1942. At the same time, 4 infantry divisions and the Corps headquarters were withdrawn to the west. Many horses had been so weakened and overexerted by the campaign that their health had irreversibly collapsed. During the return train journeys, they often had to halt to unload the horse corpses. The mud alongside the broken supply network had deprived the German army of its primary advantage, mobility. In his war diary, von Bock complained that, quote, "The Russians are impeding us far less than the wet and the mud." Quartermaster General Edward Wagner wrote on the 20th, "They can no longer be concealed. We are hung up in the muck, in the purest sense." The rainfall in October of 1941 was below average. The temperature was only 1 degree below the long-term average. These conditions were not a surprise to anyone, and any competent staff could have foreseen and mitigated many of the issues caused by the predictable weather. General Heinrich of the 43rd Army Corps reported taking 36 hours to drive only 35 kilometers, while the 137th Division reported it took 53 hours for 3 trucks to travel 40 kilometers. Fun fact, this was significantly slower than Napoleon's forces were able to travel during the same period in 1812. It was now taking up to 24 draft horses to move a single artillery gun. Sometimes the mud was so deep that the horses could fall up to their necks in the quagmire and become stuck. But mud was not the only problem. The 2093 trains that reached the Eastern Front in September had not been nearly adequate enough to meet the demand. In October, only 1,860 trains arrived. Compounding the issue, those trains were further behind the front lines. Many formations were now 300 to 400 kilometers from their supplying railway heads. Even the most fortunate formations attacking Moscow were still about 115 kilometers from the supply hub at Vyazma. Alone, this would have been a logistical catastrophe. The mud severely exacerbated these problems, and no precautions had been taken beforehand to address the conditions. Many formations found that the effort to tow supply vehicles forward through mud consumed nearly as much fuel as it brought forward. The German logistical machine, numbering over 600,000 supply vehicles in the east, had been reduced to about 75,000 by mid-November. At any one time, roughly half were in repair stations. The Wehrmacht had been demotorized. The Germans were forced to learn how to scrounge from the land, to capture and configure all Soviet vehicles they encountered simply to survive. Most divisions were now reliant on columns of horse-drawn panji wagons and Luftwaffe airdrops or river barges to move supplies. The Germans faced an increasing deployment of T-34 and KV-1 tanks by the Soviets, which were also employed with growing competence. German complaints consistently centered on their tank cannons and anti-tank guns' inability to reliably defeat Soviet tanks at range. By contrast, Soviet tank guns proved highly effective against the armor of even the heaviest German tanks in service. The Germans were forced to rely on heavy artillery or temporarily attach their 88mm flak guns in direct fire rolls. This culminated in a Hitler decree ordering that all formations on the Eastern Front be equipped with flak 88 guns. The T-34 was one of the few pieces of equipment that the Germans feared in 1941, though it appeared likely that the KV-1 tanks were often misidentified as T-34s in German reports. Soviet artillery would become feared by the Germans. However, in 1941, Soviet ranging coordination of their firepower was pretty poor, heavily restricting the effectiveness of their artillery. In Ukraine, the First Battle of Kharkiv began on the 22nd, as the forward defenses of the city were attacked by the 57th Infantry and the 101st Jaeger Divisions. The attack occurred despite Hitler's prohibition against directly assaulting Soviet cities. The Germans were so close to Kharkiv and desperately sought its shelter, in addition to the railway links flowing through the city. Several German formations would make random attacks just to capture a nearby village. They hoped this would afford them some shelter from the cold at night, but often Soviet forces endured to destroy as much shelter as possible before retreating. The assault on the city itself commenced the following day. Its start was delayed by mud that slowed the deployment of artillery and anti-tank guns. By the 24th, Kharkiv had fallen into German hands. The city was lightly defended by only the 216th Rifle Division, which was sacrificed to buy time for the 38th Army to fall back. The 216th Rifle Division had been recently reformed after being destroyed during the Uman Pocket. Therefore, it received no supporting action. The Soviets had no reason to defend the city. Its industry, including a large T-34 plant, had already been evacuated. The Sixth Army's objective had been reached at Kursk and Voronezh, linking up with the Second Army, while the 17th Army was to continue towards Stalingrad. However, on the 22nd, this plan was updated. The Sixth Army was now tasked with capturing Belgorod to secure railway connections, and the 17th Army was to establish a bridgehead at Izium. Both armies were then to halt to collect supplies for the winter, an operation estimated to take just 3 weeks. Only after achieving sufficient supplies were they to return to their previous objectives, advancing along the railway connections where possible. The 1st Panzer Army remained mostly static for the week due to extreme fuel shortages and defending attacks from the 9th Army. The 9th Army was attempting to buy time for the new 56th Army, which fielded 6 rifle divisions and 6 cavalry divisions, who were still assembling and being transported to Rostov. Manstein received new orders to capture Tyups and Krasnodar, but first he had to break through the neck of the peninsula. A breach existed in the Soviet defenses north of Inchin, but his infantry lacked speed necessary to exploit it before more Soviet forces arrived. Manstein pressed for a mobile division to be allocated for his command, but Kleist refused on the grounds of having sufficient fuel to make the transfer, and also to make his push to Rostov. He also claimed such a transfer would weaken his forces too much to capture the city. Essentially, this forced Hitler to determine if Rostov or Crimea was the priority for the forces in the south. Rostov would be chosen as the priority on the 26th. The fighting over the week was so fierce that on the 25th, Halsen claimed that his 54th Army Corps was combat ineffective. This claim was rejected by Manstein, however. The arrival of promised Luftwaffe support significantly helped protect ground forces from Soviet air attacks and hinder Soviet offensive efforts. 6 fighter groups, 3 diver-bomber groups, and 2 Italian fighter groups arrived in Ukraine. These air units were split between the Crimea and Rostov sectors while also providing fighter cover for the 17th and 6th Armies. This week also saw the commander of the Soviet 51st Army, Kuznetsov, replaced by Batov due to poor initial deployment of forces. Vice Admiral Yevchenko was placed in overall command of the peninsula to coordinate between the 51st Army and the independent Coastal Army, which had just arrived from Odessa. German offensives across the Soviet Union had stalled again. If the USSR managed to survive the year, longer-term factors would begin to take effect. An October study by General George Thomas, head of the German War Economy Office, suggested that the USSR was not as close to economic collapse as previously thought. Furthermore, American war industry was outstripping German production, which theoretically could be directed to the UK and/or the USSR in its entirety, given the United States' wartime neutrality ending stance and eventual Lend-Lease commitments. It was projected that the United States would produce approximately 5,000 combat aircraft, 2,600 armored fighting vehicles, and more than 1,600 artillery pieces in the 8 months between October of 1941 and May of 1942. This output was greater than the entire annual German production at the time. The full details of the Allied aid to the USSR were complex enough to warrant a dedicated future analysis. By October, the first protocol had been signed between the British, Americans, and Soviets, promising roughly 400 planes and 500 tanks per month, along with a range of raw materials and other weaponry, though actual deliveries would fall short of these figures. The British had already dispatched 2 convoys to the USSR prior to the agreement. The second convoy had brought 140 tanks, 100 Hurricane fighters, and 200 Universal carriers. These were the Valentine and Matilda models. The Matilda would not be too popular with the Soviets, but the Valentine would become loved as a scout tank over some time. The Soviets also criticized the low-caliber guns on both British models and the relatively poor cross-country speed. However, these tanks were still capable of matching the fielded German tanks, and the Soviets were in desperate need of more tanks. Overall, 466 British tanks would be delivered over 1941. Additionally, Britain had begun sharing information from Ultra intercepts with the Soviet Union. For those who don't know, Ultra was the British code name for the signal interception and decryption work done at Bletchley Park. However, suspicions in Moscow that the British were willing to fight to the last drop of Soviet blood had begun to surface. This situation had been fueled by the apparent reluctance of the British to actively engage the Germans on the ground in Europe or send troops into the USSR, while they were nonetheless willing to replace Soviet garrisons in occupied Iran. The fact that sending aid to the USSR was severely hindering British rearmament after its own disasters in 1940 and 1941 was overlooked. Accusations of such strained the British-Soviet relationship, recalling Soviet support for Nazi Germany against the United Kingdom months earlier. While these tensions and other factors placed strain on the alliance, they were not sufficient to fracture it, as both sides recognized their mutual need. The USSR had a distinctly stronger industrial position than the Germans. For example, the Soviet Union produced over 500 tanks in October, compared with the German output of about 387 tanks. The vast majority of Soviet tank production had already shifted to the KV-1, T-34, and T-60 models, and in the last quarter of 1941 alone, these three lines accounted for a surge of output: 441 KV-1s, 765 T-34s, and over 1,388 T-60s. This shift occurred despite the upheaval caused by evacuating a significant portion of the Soviet industry beyond the Urals. German production priorities had already shifted away from the army, and it would take months or even years to reverse this shift. Worse for Germany, there was a growing concern about the onset of hyperinflation once more. Additionally, crude oil shipments from Romania declined from 375,000 tons to 253,000 tons during October. This drop mattered greatly because the naval and air war against the Western Allies was consuming substantial amounts of fuel oil and aviation gasoline. The USSR was primarily engaged in a land and air war against the European Axis, and in theory, could dedicate all of its wartime production to this single conflict. Germany, by contrast, found itself fighting on multiple fronts: a land war against the USSR, and to some extent the Commonwealth in Africa, while also waging an air and naval war against the Commonwealth and contending with broader resource and industrial pressures. This meant Germany faced intensified demands on its industrial base to sustain operations across Europe, North Africa, and the Atlantic, whereas the USSR could still, in principle, concentrate its industrial mobilization on the European Axis front. The result was different production and logistical dynamics for each side, with the USSR able to channel more of its output towards armored, infantry, and air power suitable for the Eastern Front, while Germany had to balance expansion, occupation administration, and long supply lines across multiple theaters. The Germans increasingly desired the Caucasus oil fields to offset their limited access to oil. This economic strain would contribute to discussions about using Soviet POWs as slave labor. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube, and continue to produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that you're still looking for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel, found over at YouTube, or my podcast series, Echoes of War, found on major podcast platforms. And if you'd like to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. Over there, you can find a exclusive podcast series. It's about 36 episodes ongoing. You can get early access to all the content I make and voting rights to the subjects I will tackle next. The October 1941 front near Moscow lay in mud and attrition as Germans pressed towards Tikman and Moscow while Soviets patched up their defenses. The German advance, hampered by flooding, fuel shortages, and relentless Soviet counterattacks, stretched logistics thin, and progress was slowed. By the month's end, German forces faced supply crises, fuel shortages, and mounting casualties. prompting partial redeployments and even discussions of slowing or halting offensives.